So the principle is at work, and you will see that sort of thing going on. Perception rolls in the fantasy trip from a few years later were very much about, basically how hard it was. And in those games, it had to do with you had a 3d6 roll and you hit a target number or below. And instead of actually adjusting the target number, which is pretty common for the fantasy trip and for its descendant game of GURPS, instead, they actually added dice. So you were trying to beat it on on 4 dice. In the fantasy trip, what frequently occurred was that these were designated in the preparation. This trap, is 5d6 to spot. That door is 3d6 to spot. But one can at least conceive that certain activities, which might be handled as a dexterity roll or something like that, that you could use the same logic and you could say, okay, well, it's 4d6 against X because that's harder. That's not in the text, but it is just like one. I mean, you just kind of wiggle your butt and you're sitting on that application of the rules. Very, very easy to get there from here. But unless somebody can point out something in Chivalry and Sorcery or Traveler or something like that, where I would submit that there are mechanics, just like the kinds I mentioned, that do allow for looking at this immediate circumstance and saying, okay, that's this kind of roll. The one that I know the best would be Champions from 1981, the first Champions, in which, and there's 2 kinds. Number 1 is very situational. You do a tricky move. You do a surprise move. You say something about the special effects of the power that you're using, and it makes sense. The GM goes, +1. Now, whether that applies, for example, to skill checks in terms of difficulty and stuff, the answer is probably yes, because those aren't that different from rolling to hit. The mechanics are slightly different, but the principle is very similar. So that seems like that kind of folds in. If you can get a +1 to hit because of that tricky thing, well, getting a +1 on your security systems because you learned the code from that dude doesn't really seem very difficult to toss into play. Another thing, and by the way, in that game, we don't have these extremely naturalistic normal guy skill sets like you have in BRP or RuneQuest. So they're not really, you don't have an oratory skill. You don't have the climbing skill in Champion is for super crazy climbing, not just climbing anything like it is in RuneQuest. RuneQuest, it's the climbing skill is for any time you climb, like a guy climbing. Champions, it's about kooky climbing. So they're not really comparable, in looking at the skill systems. So I would say that even the bonuses in Champions are thematically different. They occur at a different scale of operations, a different kind of rollable activity that's different from the very naturalistic, this is how we simulate anybody climbing anything throughout, NPCs and PCs alike. Everybody's out there using the system, even if we don't know anything about them. It's kind of the attitude of the way RuneQuest was developing, if not in its very first form. So perhaps that's relevant. But what is also interesting that you find in Champions is the extremely explicit aesthetic bonus, whether it's a plus to hit, whether it is an extra die of effect, just because. Why because? Because I'm excited. I'm the game master and I'm excited. That's rock. Go you. I like playing with you. What you fucking just said right there. Oh, get a die. No standards. No conditions. No resource. It's just something we do at the table. It appears very rarely in role-playing from that point forward. It appears in the Whispering Vault, which is no surprise because Mike Nystuen was a line developer for Champions, an early player of Champions. And it appears, given that very same pedigree of Champions to Whispering Vault to Sorcerer. That's where the bonus dice and Sorcerer come from, and they're basically supposed to be exactly the same thing. But that's not the situational judgment of the conditions in the same way that James is asking about. Not in a legalistic way. The excitement that one may have is about the excitement of the situation, so there's some overlap there, maybe more overlap than it appears. So those are the places where I see it. Now, someone else is going to have to comb through the many different texts that are booming and proliferating through the early 80s, because I think it shows up pretty damn fast that you have, say, in a system with a percentile dice, naturalistic skill system, that there's wiggle room of, -10, -5, even as written, +5, +10%. There's kind of a little wiggle room of, Game Master going, this seems kind of tough this time. You see it much more formally in what I think is a negative trend in 90s games, where you have the target number. And in a lot of these games, you're trying to hit a target number or higher. And so the target number to hit goes up given the qualities and the difficulty of the task. And then you have another set of modifiers, maybe affecting the roll or maybe increasing the target number more. Often it's in another slight currency. You're actually decreasing the roll, debiting the roll. So for the immediate circumstances, whether it's under, how hard is it given right now, this became very common in role-playing texts, and obviously nobody understood percentages, because if you apply both, okay, it's a really hard task, and it's a situation makes it a really hard task, both of those are supposed to apply. Isn't the first one accounting for it being a really hard task? But also remember, percentages multiply, so all of a sudden, you're dealing with, I don't think they understood that they were suddenly busting everybody down to 15, 20% success. They couldn't have. When I played, games with this, we just ignored that second set and just said, well, how hard is it? And rated it based on the first table and just used those because that made a lot of sense. And the other was just gratuitous, destruction of your chances, and couldn't see why. The logic was the same as the first table. So what the fuck? Anyway, so things got a little weird about that when people tried to implement a formal version of situational wiggling. Couldn't really answer exactly which first game. I think I've spotted the roots of it. And again, in some of those earlier games, somebody probably might find a paragraph where somebody did a somewhat specific version of that, exactly the kind of thing James means in some paragraph somewhere. But I'm thinking that it followed quite quickly on the heels of the games I'm talking about. And by the time we hit the mid-'80s, so not very long after that, we are really starting to see, the explicit statement of those. If anybody knows or has a candidate for which game did that first or early, I'd be happy to see it. But as I say, I don't think it happened in isolation. I think it happened in the context of those other things that I was talking about. All right. Last question. We have Sean. Did you have any experience using any of Rolemaster's laws? He's referring to the early publications from Iron Crown called Arms Law, Claw Law, Spell Law, Creature Law. Creature Law, or was that? I think that's just Claw Law. Anyway, but I remember when those came out on the hobby store shelves. They were real, old school paper pamphlets, very wargamery. Well, they're from Iron Crown. Very wargamery looking and full of tables and charts. And as with many things, including Melee and Wizard from the fantasy trip, it was intended that you would be playing some fantasy role-playing game, Dungeons and Dragons, and you felt that its rules for combat and magic were unsatisfying. Well, along has come handy dandy Steve Jackson game. Well, the metagaming or Iron Crown, and here are handy dandy, drop-ins that you can use for that stuff instead. Well, that's the way it was presented, and very quickly both of those became their own role-playing game. The Fantasy Trip for metagaming and Rollmaster for the different laws books. Okay, so that's what Sean is talking about. He's talking about those original publications, and he asks, quite reasonably, do you have any experience using any of these in conjunction with another system? In other words, as advertised, as suggested, as, why we publish these things, according to them. Said, and if so, did that add something to the overall experience? That's a little vague, but fortunately I don't have to answer it because the question is no. When I played the Fantasy Trip, Wizard, or Melee, and we just turned it into a role-playing game because, we had characters and we liked these rules and it was cool and we played that. And then the Fantasy Trip comes out and you're like, oh, okay, I've died and gone to heaven. But the point is that, no, I did not do as advertised or as promoted, where you are playing some other fantasy role-playing game, and then you port those in and substitute those rules for the ones in the primary game. So regardless of how often that was promoted or stated as the purpose of these things, I never saw it and I never did it. Let's see. In the timing, movement, and maps discussion at Adepts Play, I brought up zone of control and the stickiness of characters. You mentioned almost putting such a system into Champions now. Do you feel comfortable giving a broad explanation of how that might have worked in Champions now? I like the comfortable part. Oh, gee, Sean, I don't know. That makes me feel uncomfortable. No, I'm sorry. Had to tease you there. Couldn't resist. But what's being referred to goes to Melee, 1977, and then followed through in Wizard, and then became a feature of the Fantasy Trip. And since Champions, the original Champions, basically took all of the combat mechanics from Melee and Wizard and went and used them. Since that happened, it's no surprise that this question could be asked. In Melee and Wizard and the Fantasy Trip as a whole, eventually, we're talking about a hex map, and your character, therefore, is standing in a hex, which in that game is a meter. And surrounded by 6 hexes, right? The 3 in front of your guy is 3 hexes. That's your front hexes. You've got the 2 just behind you to the right and left. Those are your side hexes. And then the one directly behind you, which is your rear hex. Attacks from the side are at +2. Attacks from the rear are at +4 on 3d6 for a target or less. Those are very significant modifiers, by the way. But here's the point about those front hexes. Your character is engaged when you are in someone else's front hexes. And the rules for movement are based on engagement. So by definition, and it's very explicit in the rules, there's no extrapolation in what I'm about to say. You're trucking along and you pass through someone's front hex. Well, you're not passing through. You're braked, right? Skid right there and stop. Passing through that, entering that front hex means they've got you. You are engaged. Doesn't matter whether they have already gone this turn. Doesn't matter if they're doing something completely different. It could be casting a spell on someone way over there or something. No, when you hit that front hex, full stop, you're done. Do not go further. That's what he means by the stickiness. And from then on, all your character's options come from the engaged badge. Getting out of being engaged is a little tricky. You actually have to perform an action, right? You can't move during the movement phase, you can't just move away. You instead have to wait for your action during the turn, and when you go, you make a dexterity check to see if you can get out of being engaged. So it's pretty sticky, clearly. Now, how that played through the 80s in later games that are heavily influenced by Champions and so on, pretty much lost that. But I missed something here. Okay, back to Champions, 1981. Very soon after everything I'm talking about. I just made it sound like Champions is the same. It's not. Champions isn't the same. There are no there are front and side hexes and stuff, but it's not a big deal. And there is no engagement. You don't get stuck when you pass through there. And there's a couple of interesting reasons for that. One is that the hex in Champions is 2 meters. It's not your personal space. It is your zone of effect, so that you can just reach into the next hex. A hex, so the adjacent hex is not in your easy reach. You actually have to sort of get to the edge of your own hex and reach into it to do that. And that's actually quite significant for Champions, that the character wiggles around or moves, sways or leans or shuffles a little or somewhat gets around even inside their own hex. And that's why a lot of the distances are very approximate. And the idea, if the attack just reaches your hex, we have to kind of look at what that attack is. We have to kind of look at what you were doing last to think about whether it actually hits you or not. I mean, it's not fixed. It's not as battle-matty as it looks. So therefore, the idea that somebody can zoom in front of your nose and fly past you or something, if it's, a hex away, we're talking 2 meters, potentially, away from you. So no, you cannot just, put out your hand and clothesline them. So the stickiness in Champions is absent. So what I was talking about with Champions now is whether I wanted to sort of not just dial it back to original Champions, which I was doing for most things, but also whether I wanted to go back further and introduce the stickiness. And that's what Sean was talking about, that I was mentioning this, and that's why. Ultimately, I chose not to, and to textually emphasize the looseness and the bigness of the hexes. So that was my thinking. By the way, other people who were heavily influenced by Champions and Melee and so forth in their combat designs, specifically the designers of Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition, and then games which have proceeded from there, they use squares, not hexes, but and I don't know if they actually invented this. It may have cropped up in role-playing games before. I don't really know. Was, the opportunity attack. That if somebody passes through a square that you can legally affect, if you were fighting someone in it, if they pass through it, you get an attack on them. You just get basically a free attack on them. And that was kind of their split the difference. You don't basically suddenly get shepherds hooked from off stage, to stop in that spot, but neither do you, pass unscathed right past this dangerous person's, zone of effect. So I thought about that too, whether that was something that I really actually, more than the stickiness where you actually had to stop, I really thought about whether opportunity attacks were suitable. And it ultimately came down to whether I was trying to stay clean or whether I was trying to pull in anything and everything from every other game I knew. And I was kind of aiming more for the former, to kind of drill down into what I considered the strengths of early Champions and then elaborate from there, rather than kitchen sink and say, okay, good thing there, good thing here, and let's shove them together. So that's kind of why I didn't do that. Although the logic of doing so, tossing in opportunity attacks into Champions, not the worst or dumbest thing I have ever encountered, as an idea, not by a long shot. I just didn't do that for the reasons that I mentioned. I hope that was interesting. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, awesome patrons, for being the patrons. And I hope this has been a good time because I really liked those questions. Take care.